Which brings us up to the cocktail.
Brings us up to the gin cocktail, doesn't it?
Yes, I'm sure you all have heard the stories of the birth of the cocktail.
Balance, Columbia Repository,
The Catherine Hustler stirring with a feather, which actually came from James Fenimore Cooper's The Spy.
Yes.
The Betsy Flanagan story, that was fiction based on an actual character, but
and considering again, the gin cocktail was the first of the cocktail range. It wasn't whiskey. Whiskey really wasn't developed then.
Let's jump up to 1859.
Let's go up to 1859. Let's dispel one more thing. You know this guy Jerry, the Professor Thomas, and he did create the first bartending manual. I will say that, and I commend him for it. The one thing I do have to say is he did travel to Europe in 1859. And that's before he wrote his cocktail book. In fact, in his cocktail book, he has two recipes. One is for gin punch, which he has in his notations from a guy named Alexis Benoit Soyer, who was the head chef of the Reform Club in London, who actually established in 1851 the first American bar in London at the Universal Symposium of all nations, which was the most expensive restaurant in the world and used to be right at Albert Hall. It existed for a whole 7 months. But
by our research, there's also another 7 recipes in Jerry Thomas's 1862 book that came from Soyer.
Yeah, but not to say anything American against the other, but gin cocktails were predominant in that. In Harry Johnson's 1882, which is the first time the word martini comes around, but we'll talk about that later. Again, gin was the predominant spirit used all the way through. There was a change that happened in the 1890s. People started losing it when it comes to sugary stuff. So there was no longer Old Tom. It became more London Dry. London Dry became the predominant in almost all the drink books that you see out.
We found a great article about changing tastes from this period where they did say that people were no longer interested in sweet flavors, that dry was the trend, and it was an 1890s article talking about the introduction of olives into drinks in general.
We'll tell you about that later too. You know when the first cocktail party happened? Where? 1917, St. Louis, Missouri. Mrs. Julius Walsh decided that she was going to have a feature of cocktails for 50 people, and she served them, guess what? Gin, clover leaves, gin fizzes, Bronx, martinis. Oh yeah, she did serve some Manhattans, but we won't discuss that.
But it was really Prohibition that brought gin to the forefront in the United States, and for a very good reason. You could no longer make whiskey. Whiskey took years in a barrel. Vodka was not even on the charts by that time.
God no, Smirnoff is still in Paris.
Rum, again, was something that took ages in a barrel. Gin was a spirit that you could make in no time at all. And if you had a bathtub that you could load with neutral spirit and with botanicals, let them rest for a few hours or a few days, you could actually make a serviceable gin.
Serviceable. Add a little oil, turpentine.
Of course, if you were going to the grocery store and going to the baking section at that time, you could find in the icing flavoring sections a whole row named whiskey, rum, gin, brandy, and you could just buy one of those and dump it into your neutral spirits as well. But
it also meant that organized crime came in. And with organized crime, you had gin mills, you had people smuggling not just rum, they always call them rum runners, but there were a lot of gin runners that were bringing in British gin into the US via Canada. So this was something that went on forever, and so you had
did you just jump over Jake Leg?
Yeah, I kind of have to because he said we don't have any time.
Oh.
So that's why I have to do that. We'll mention Jake Leg later.
All right.
Yeah, we'll be back, don't worry. But, so, 1920s, yeah, okay, bad stuff. 1930s, thank God there's repeal. Thank God there's Hollywood. Thank God there was the Thin Man. You had people thinking more about cocktails because, hey, I can have stuff again. Even though it wasn't the best stuff in the world because there were grain shortages because of the wars, because of the Dust Bowl. Over in the UK, there were also grain shortages. But people were into cocktails. They were into gin cocktails. And you know what the funny thing is to this day, the last shot of any film, any shooting, the last shot the crew does is the martini shot. Because since the 30s, everyone went out for martinis. Cast, crew, directors, everyone. And that was it. Martini time. So what changed?
Oh,
Things
the
changed.
60s, the 80s, of course, vodka came booming in. There were a lot of advances, industrial advances. Frozen concentrated orange juice arrived on the scene about the same time. The soda gun, 1968. It was just a bad time for mixing great drinks.
And of course, then it was my generation that said, I'm not going to drink that stuff. That's what my dad drinks. I'm going to have some Boone's Farm strawberry wine and some beer.
Wine and beer came booming up, and for a very good reason, because the mixed drinks had lost the inherent quality for the most part, with the exception of very few establishments around the world.
Yeah. What can you say? But luckily...
Till about the late 80s.
Yeah, believe it or not, one of the first sightings we saw was in 1988. A woman named Lola that was working at a restaurant called Delilah's decided that she was going to do a 60 cocktail menu that she called a martini menu. Let's not have the argument about cocktail glasses versus martini glasses. And this was the first time that we saw that, you know, people are starting to come back to cocktails. It was Gen X who's saying, oh, wow, you know, this is kind of cool. We can have lounge music. 1991, Seattle Martini competition started, one of the first ones, where people actually pitted themselves against each other and said, I can make a better martini than you. Then, because it's time for us to go, sometime in 1995, 3 books arrived in the world, published. One of them was by Barnaby Conrad called The Martini, which was not about martinis. It was about martini art and martini in art and in film, with 4 martinis. Then there was this book, Shaken Not Stirred. Hi.
Which
that
got
mentioned
us-
martinis. And then there was this guy who came up with Martini Companion. That's sort of where gin went from there.
To give you an idea of where things stood at the time, we got emails shortly after our book came out, both from Plymouth Gin and from Lillet, asking a very simple question. How have you guys ever heard of us?
Yeah. Yeah. That was it. It was like, I mean, you've heard of Plymouth Gin? We don't even sell it in the US. Well, I like this stuff. I'll have to bring it home from the UK.
And hopefully no generation in the future will be asked that question again.
Yes, hopefully. But we'll see you later. We've got to talk about martinis with you.